Joining us here on ET Now, you're watching India Tonight. I'm Nivedna, Prabhu, and joining me is my colleague Sumita. Kareer. Our top focus clearly, given that global geopolitics is testing fault lines, with US President Donald Trump openly questioning whether Putin truly wants a deal to end the Ukraine conflict, while signaling that both Kyiv and Moscow must show flexibility, Sumita.
Absolutely, and in fact, this even as Washington is pushing for talks, trade tensions are rising between Washington and New Delhi. India, meanwhile, is looking at other geographies for diversification of its exports. 50 new countries have been identified. But today, Russian officials in the Russian embassy in New Delhi have indicated that the country's markets are open to trading for Indian goods amidst challenges that are arising out of Trump's tariffs. So the question is, are new credible trade corridors emerging for India? Let's first listen into what the Russian President Putin, inviting Trump to Moscow for the next round of talks, had to say.
I believe we had a very productive meeting. There were many points that we agreed on, most of them, I would say, a couple of big ones that we haven't quite gotten there, but we've made some headway. So there's no deal until there's a deal. I will call up NATO in a little while. I will call up the various people that I think are appropriate, and I'll, of course, call up President Zelensky and tell him about today's meeting. Again, Mr. President, I'd like to thank you very much, and we'll speak to you very soon and probably see you again very soon. Thank you very much, Vladimir.
Next time in Moscow.
Oh, that's an interesting one. I don't know. I'll get a little heat on that one, but I could see it possibly happening.
All right, so Donald Trump revealing his biggest fear, but the question really is the Trump doctrine losing face and friends for the United States? And can Russia be a credible trading geography for Indian goods? To discuss some and more of those points, I'm now joined by a stellar panel of guests and geopolitical experts. Joining us on the show live is Raymond Vickery, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce, Trade Development. Deepak Bhojwani is also with us. He's the former Indian ambassador to Latin America, and Akshat Singh, independent foreign policy consultant. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for taking the time out and speaking to us here on ET Now. Let me come to you first, Mr. Vickery. Let's first talk about what Donald Trump stated today. He said that earlier that Putin does want a deal, and now he says that Putin perhaps does not want a deal. So is the president of peace actually looking at resolving this issue, or is he actually working in favor of Putin while testing the West's resolve?
Well, thanks very much for having me. I think you've put your finger really on the key question, and that is, does Putin really want peace? You know, peace, like war, must be waged. It's not a one-off real estate kind of transaction, which President Trump seems to think it is. And it's not based just on some sort of conception of personal friendship. It requires a strategy, and it requires coalition partners to wage peace and bring it about. Unfortunately, the United States at this time has neither. Does not have a strategy. As I said, President Trump is enamored of this real estate developer's approach that everything is transactional. You get people in a room, you decide, some come out winners, some come out losers, and the deal is done. That's just not the way it works internationally. I think that President Trump's remarks that that Putin may not want peace is finally waking up to the reality. The reality is that Putin views his grandeur, whether he's great or not, whether Russia's great or not, by the standards of the 19th century. And that is, can you take over other people's land and control their people and become the great that way? That was the way the Russian Empire was built. The Soviet Union was nothing but an inheritance of that imperialistic design. So that's the situation we're in. I would hope that great democracies like India will step up to fill the void, to act on their own values in trying to promote peace and prosperity throughout the world. But this has to be done based upon values of democracy, rights of the individual, which India holds dear, as opposed to just the transactional approach that our president is using at this time.
Absolutely, Mr. Vickery. In fact, as you make those opening remarks and given the aspect of how you've also read into that, transactional is one aspect of what we're seeing here. But Ambassador, thank you very much also for taking the time out and joining us this evening and also being patient while I've had that opportunity to come to you. We heard what Mr. Vickery had to say. But here's something interesting. Given the fact that Trump calls himself the president of peace, now given this statement that we're looking at, yet he admits it's possible Putin doesn't even want to deal. You know, from Washington's standpoint also, does that make India's continued engagement with Russia look like hedging? And on the other side, is Trump's doctrine, tariffs on allies, doubts on adversaries, leaving America with fewer friends and less credibility in the global trade leadership?
Look, it's clear to me that Trump is out for some sort of glory. I think he basically thinks that the art of the deal can work in any context. I think he's completely wrong. As far as Russia is concerned, he's going to have to give much more than he can get for Ukraine or whoever else. Forget about the Europeans in this context. So he's desperate for a deal, and he's using a lot of bluster, in my opinion, because he's claiming that if Russia doesn't come to the table, doesn't agree to this or that, there's going to be severe consequences. I don't see what more severe consequences there can be, apart from the 18 packages of sanctions by the European Union, going on to a 19th, the massive sanctions imposed by the US on Russia itself, and now increasingly being threatened on countries like India, Brazil, and so on. So basically, Trump is lashing out, trying to ensure that he gets a deal and he doesn't look bad. But the fact of the matter is that this isn't his world. This is not the world of the US. This is not the 20th century. This is the 21st century, which is a multipolar world. This is also a world in which countries like India and Brazil are not subjugated. The Europeans have subjugated themselves to a certain extent because they've sort of hypothecated their security to the US, and now they're paying the price. They're going to have to pay a higher price, even a higher price in the future, and they've painted themselves into a corner over Ukraine because they've committed themselves to a situation in which even if they accept what Russia's minimal terms are, which is land, etc., the land that Russia currently has in its possession in Ukraine, they're going to have to give up a lot more. And Trump will ensure that. Trump will ensure that because he wants a deal. As far as India is concerned, there is no question of giving in to Trump's absurd demands that we can't buy oil from wherever we want to. There have been reports recently that our imports from Russia dipped in July. They dipped in early August. But today's reports are that the bookings are going up again for September. So I don't see any disruption as far as India is concerned in its trade in oil or any other commodity with Russia. We went up to an unprecedented level of about almost $70 billion of trade in the previous financial year. This is 24-25, which ended in March 25. And I think the future is looking pretty bright because as far as the Russians are concerned, they realize that we are as committed as they are to this bilateral relationship. So whatever happens with Ukraine, with Europe, with US under Mr. Trump and so on, India and Russia, the relationship is going to strengthen, if anything.
Right, Ambassador Bhojwani, as you put that into perspective, stating that, of course, India-Russia relationship is only strengthening, even as Donald Trump is attempting to sort of weaken this relationship by putting secondary sanctions on India. And, of course, there are further threats as well on that front. But let me come to you, Akshat. Now, even though India is diversifying to other geographies, but particularly what opportunities does Russia present, and how much of the $500 billion that India and the United States pledged in the beginning of this year, how much of that can be diverted to Russia? Because we did hear from a Russian embassy officials this morning that if India is finding any challenges with respect to trading in the United States, well, the Russian market is open to goods from India.
Thanks for having me today, Sumita. I think that's a great question. But the fundamental problem with the question is that we presuppose that Russia in the first place can replace the US. I would like to challenge that premise altogether, right? So if you look at the trade data for the past few years, US and India, the trade is at about $100 billion. On good years, it's about 130, $140 billion. A bulk of that is India's exports to the US, right, which range anywhere between 60 to $80 billion. Now, when we look at the trade data for Russia, pre-pandemic levels, India-Russia trade used to be at about 10.5, $11 billion. And post-pandemic, since the dispute has started, factoring in oil, this trade has gone up to about $64 billion, out of which about 45 to 50 is just oil. Can Russia replace US as an export destination for India? The answer is a staggering no. For every dollar India exports to the US, for every dollar India exports to Russia, India exports about $18 to the US. If we enter a situation in which US is no longer a viable trade partner, a feasible strategy would not be to rely solely on Russia. Russia will be an important hedge, especially when it comes to chemicals, especially when it comes to some pharmaceuticals. However, the overall replacement strategy for India would need to include a combination of the European Union, of Gulf, and of Southeast Asia. The reason why I mentioned these three geographies in particular is because we know that the Gulf is a pretty good reselling, re-export market for gems and precious stones, which constitutes a significant part of India's export basket. Southeast Asia, because India can export some of its tech components to that area, and pharmaceuticals for the European Union. So if we are thinking about, if we ever reach a situation when we have to seriously consider replacing the US, Russia is not a one-stop shop. We will need to figure out a basket of countries which can probably be viable trade partners to India.
Right, Akshat. In fact, as you put that into perspective, Ambassador, coming back to you, given what we heard Akshat say, and more importantly, put that into the concept of what we should be looking at. But here we have Russia dangling the idea of opening its market to Indian goods, just as the US is tightening access. And based on past episodes, Ambassador, like cryogenic engines and defense cooperation, is this kind of opening that India should seize, or is it a trap that risks over-dependence on a sanctioned economy?
With what Akshat has said, not just with his statistics, but the fact of the matter is that Russia doesn't have the capacity to absorb the kind of exports that India has been sending to the US. Having said that, there are also some exports like pharmaceuticals, I think electronics, if I'm not mistaken, and perhaps some others, which have not been sanctioned so far, even under the 25% by Mr. Trump. Now, a lot will depend upon how the US plays this game. If they're going to levy sanctions on all exports of approximately $90 billion, then that will really change the game. And I think it'll stiffen India's resolve. I doubt they'll do that, because my informal understanding, and this is through my business contacts, is that, well, on very, very good authority, but I'll wait till it actually happens, is that the 25% was just to attract attention, as senior US officials have been putting it. Perhaps that's true. Maybe it's not, because we never know, because it's eventually President Trump who will decide. But if they go the whole hog and they put 50% on the $90 billion or whatever, we will have to look for other markets. And as Akshat has rightly said, there are other geographies where we can look to. We have had massive deficits with other countries, including in the Gulf, from whom we have traditionally bought massive quantities of oil and not exported that much. Now the trade has begun to be diversified. There has been talk of also joining or having free trade agreements, which we've done with the EFTA, we've done with the UK, we've done with Australia, amplifying those. There's Latin America, but there's not that much scope to increase exports in the short term, in the near term. We're going to have to do this painstakingly and very slowly. And if the US abruptly decides that no, we're going to bring down the hammer on all these exports, then there's going to be a complete strategic shift. And I think India is going to play very hardball in that case. If the US is sensible the US administration here. And despite what Scott Bessent and Peter Navarro and even the Commerce Secretary have been saying, I think they would find that they've got a hard task ahead of them, because while India can suffer short-term pain, there will be a lot of suffering of particularly the labor-intensive areas, those which have made investments in electronics, pharma, and so on. But eventually we will be able to diversify. We've done it in the past, we'll do it in the future. It's really the US's call, because India is
Absolutely.
building itself up.
Absolutely, Ambassador Bhojwani, you make a very valid point, and that's essentially what the Indian government is aiming at doing as well. We're looking at finalizing some of the FTAs with the countries with whom we are currently in talks with. There is an attempt to fast-track the EU FTA as well, have a BIT with Saudi Arabia separately. But let me also ask this question from you, Mr. Vickery. When Akshat and Ambassador Bhojwani made that point about the fact that Russian geography might just not be enough, given the fact that India, US are looking at bilateral trade worth $500 billion by 2030, but India, Russia are looking at bilateral trade worth $100 billion by 2030. So will that mean perhaps an expansion of the Russian geography, if that were to perhaps expand into a larger trade grouping like the BRICS to counter the United States as far as addressing these trade imbalances is concerned?
Well, I think that what has to happen here is that India needs to step up and show some world-class leadership in regard to trade. President Trump, unfortunately, has basically destroyed the multilateral approach, which has served to keep the peace largely and to promote prosperity since World War II. And I'm talking about World Trade Organization, general agreements on tariffs and trade, a rules-based trading system. This will not be put back together immediately, but India can show some leadership in accordance with its own values. And it's not the same to deal with an aggressor like Russia, which has been against and tried to destroy the values of the UN Charter, which India has supported, and dealing with other great democracies, whether they be in Europe and Japan. So sure, India needs to be able to look to its own interest in terms of diversification, but jumping into the arms of Russia to make up the slack is not a strategy. It is not a winning strategy. In the Cold War, India basically said, well, we can side with the Soviet Union on many of these things, and we will be able to promote our own prosperity. Well, that didn't work out, and it's not going to work out with Russia. That isn't to say that India isn't going to have relations with Russia. Sure they are. But India needs to look to its own values, provide some leadership, and get back to a rules-based approach to trade rather than just how I can profit on this particular deal right now. There's a danger with a person like President Trump of falling into his view of the world, and that is a transactional view. That's not an interest of India. It's not in the interest of the world. So I think India needs to look at this not only as a problem, an issue to be solved, but an opportunity to provide leadership in accordance with the democratic values which have made independent India a great nation.
Absolutely, Mr. Vickery. In your opinion, that is the need of the hour. But Akshat, coming back to you, what is the risk that India's refining and re-export of Russian crude is cast internationally, not as energy security, but as opportunism? And how could that perception perhaps affect India's global standing?
Thank you, Nivedna. In the few years since I've known him, I rarely ever disagree with Mr. Vickery. So just to add to some of the arguments that he's making, it isn't just about Russia providing a stable market base for India's exports. Let's also assume that India meets its objective of doing about $100 billion in trade while doing about $500 billion trade all over. That essentially means Russia now constitutes 20% of India's total external trade. That is not a winning strategy. I just want to drill that down before I move to your question about oil. Um, Doing 20% trade with any one given country, especially when that country is going through the turbulence like Russia is, and the recent dispute with Ukraine is not um, new turbulence. It is just a flare up of decades old turbulence. So doing that is not strategically wise. Now, should India depend solely on Russian oil? I will extend the same logic to this question as well. Depending on any one country for any one commodity is not wise, especially when the price for that commodity that you're trading in such high volumes has been artificially brought down due to a geopolitical conflict, right? Um, the price of crude, the discounted price of crude will not always remain discounted. India, if it builds its industrial systems on the basis of that price, on the basis of reliance on Russia, we can assume that in the next 10, 15 years, in the next 5, 10 years, whenever, God willing, the dispute comes to a resolution and other countries start buying oil from Russia, India will not be able to afford to buy oil at the same price. And at that point, of course, there's going to be a reshifting of crude prices around the world. But point is that it's not a good business practice to base your entire industrial ecosystem on inflationary prices.
That's right.
And therefore, yes, I feel that it would be wise that India does expand, diversify its crude oil supply, not only from the Gulf, but also from partners like Venezuela.
Right, Akshat. So don't put all your eggs in one basket is essentially the view that you're giving out, of course, along with other gentlemen on the show as well. Let me come to you, Ambassador Bhojwani. We're talking even as the External Affairs Minister is currently in Russia. He's going to have bilateral talks with the Deputy Prime Minister and his Russian counterpart as well. And economic and trade issues will be the key focus points of discussion as well. So while, the Russian chargé d'affaires today stated the defense and co-production of engines is currently happening, in India by Russia, and they have a view. I mean, they're doing it essentially to boost Make in India. But what, according to you, is realistically possible for India to collaborate with Russia on, and how much further can we expand our economic partnership?
Oh, there's no limits. There's no limits to the economic partnership. I've just written an article in The Wire, came out yesterday, about how through the last several decades, it is Russia that has backed us up, while the US has been imposing sanctions, embargoes, refusing technology, and refusing what so-called dual-use technology equipment to India. Gradually, through our nuclear program, the years when we had our nuclear explosions, they tried to choke off World Bank loans to us. It didn't work. We went to the Resurgent India bonds, and we raised, within 2 years, $9 billion from non-resident Indians. But I'd like to go back to what your other panelist, Mr. Vickery, said about values and rules-based. Now, I have a serious issue when it comes to the US talking about rules-based order and values. We have a history through the last several decades of illegal wars and invasions in Vietnam, Iraq, you name it, where absolutely no provocation. And the Americans, of course, followed by the Brits and a couple of other strategic appendages, Australia and so on, went in and bombed the hell out of Iraq with absolutely no provocation. It was illegal based on lies. Vietnam was even worse. So we're not talking about values here. We're talking about national interest, naked US national interest, which continues to persist. Now, as far as values of democracy and so on are concerned, I don't see democracy prevailing in the US, at least, and not as of now. A lot of Americans would agree with me. It's all over the internet. Furthermore, I don't see how you can talk of values when the US, not just under this president, but even under the previous president, has been arming billions of dollars to Israel, which is carrying out a genocide over the past 2 years in Palestine. What values are we talking about? Let's get real here. The US has absolutely no standing.
But Ambassador Bhojwani, as you make those imperative points, we'll get your audio line checked because we're running into some sort of technical issue. But Mr. Vickery, let me come to you. Given how much trade diversification room does India, in fact, really have, especially when secondary sanctions risk hangs over any expansion with Russia? In fact, could this moment accelerate India's shift towards de-dollarization and settlement in local currencies, or is that a little too premature?
Well, it is perfectly apparent that India needs to look to its own interest, but I would say that its interests include values. It is not the case that two wrongs make a right, and simply being able to say, yeah, well, you guys did it wrong, so we're entitled to do it wrong too. That's not the way in which a great democracy or a great nation should go forward. I think that it is the case that India has options, and it should exercise those options, whether they be with Europe, whether they be with Japan, whether they be in Africa, whether they be in Latin America. But India is not going to prosper if it throws itself into reaction against what it deems, and many times rightly, deems to be bad conduct by others. It needs to be able to look to its own interest, which include values, and move forward accordingly.
Right, Mr. Vickery. Let me come to you, Akshat, once again. So when Donald Trump states that the next few weeks might be critical and that perhaps a lot, indicating that perhaps a lot could be transpiring behind the scenes, what is it that you're picking up from his statement? And is Russia interested in any kind of a diplomatic ramp-off?
Look, Sumita, I think it is a little primitive to argue about the merits and demerits of a rules-based order. We have done this multiple times in the past, and our only post-World War teaching has been we stick to a rules-based order. The US has lost some moral authority due to the current presidency, due to some of the past actions that the US has taken, some of which were mentioned by the ambassador. But that still doesn't give us an opening for whataboutery vis-a-vis our relationship with Russia. For a rules-based order to persist and for a rules-based order to continue, every country has to act responsibly. Just because one particular country, the US in this case, is not acting responsibly, that does not give India a free pass. I think the leaders in India do realize that. Coming to your question on President Trump's comments about the next few weeks being, the next couple of weeks being critical, I think this is a pressure tactic more than anything else. We have seen multiple times from the White House with regards to multiple countries where the president has set deadlines and then moved the deadlines for trade discussions, has created this sense of urgency about why things need to get done. It's a business principle. It's called the principle of scarcity. It's a tactic used in persuasion. So I wouldn't read too much into it. The only thing that I would be mindful of, and I would like to keep an eye on in the horizon, is President Trump's mediation of Russia and Ukraine. We saw President Trump had a very productive meeting, as he called it, with President Putin, and then shortly after, a very productive meeting with President Zelensky. I don't believe that we can expect a truce or a ceasefire or a resolution of the conflict in the next few weeks, primarily because of something that the ambassador mentioned. The basic minimum asked by Russia is essentially 488 kilometers square of territory that they're giving versus thousands of kilometers of territory that they're taking in key strategic areas in Ukraine. So I don't expect this resolution to go through in the next couple of weeks. But if there is any movement from the White House in the next few weeks, it will be pertaining to the resolution between the two countries there.
Right, Akshat. In fact, as you say that, of course, we're going to keep a close eye on how that is also going to pan out. But Ambassador, Okay, we have you back on the show. Let me quickly get in a word from you before we wrap up, Ambassador. Given the fact that the US has repeatedly tried to deny India strategic technologies in the past, only to watch India turn to Russia or develop its own, if Trump now uses tariffs and financial levers, do you see India once again gravitating towards that route? Or has the trade imbalance with the US become too large to risk?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I have been a practitioner of diplomacy and an analyst thereafter since I retired, and I can assure you, at least from my personal point of view, that we will come out of this better off. Trump may have inadvertently, and the US administration, it's not just Trump, he's just the spokesman, and of course, the bargainer. But it's the US administration repeatedly that, and this is just the latest example of how they've tried to pressure India completely without reason. And this is acknowledged by most people, right-thinking people, even as they stomp all over the ground. I mean, your panelists are trying to say that, look, what happened in the past, let's not dig it up and so on. That's rubbish. Because if you talk about values, values are immutable. They are universal. And even today, Trump and company, and even some European countries, are abetting Israel's genocide in Gaza. People don't want to talk about it because it's inconvenient. Fine, we don't talk about that. We go on to what we are doing. Here, we are going to diversify. We are wanting to buy oil from Venezuela and Iran, which President Trump and his cronies, including the Europeans, have embargoed for us. And what happens? We would love to buy, and we would if we could. The problem is that we have companies that are precisely linked up with the international globalized networks. And therefore, they have no choice.
That's
They've
right.
been hobbled. I was a director on the Bharat Petroleum. We were buying billions of dollars of oil from all over the world, including the US, where we started just a few years ago. But now, what we are being told is that you have to buy from us. You cannot buy from Venezuela. Thou shalt not go to Iran, and so on and so forth. Whose interest is this? Is it in India's interest? Is it in the global interest? Are you trying to
Absolutely.
tell me that Iranians have no right to sell their own oil? That's rubbish. So anyway, we will get past this.
That's
And
right.
the good thing about this may be that we will have industries that can diversify genuinely. We will have exporters who can seek other markets, and we will have a government that finally realizes that, look, you'd better not put your eggs in the US basket, because that's what we've been doing. We're not putting it into the Russian basket. The Russian basket, I can assure
Absolutely,
you,
Ambassador.
is basically going to be technology driven, strategic. That's it. We're not going to be selling
Right,
them
Ambassador.
tens of billions of dollars, but nevertheless,
Right.
we will diversify.
Right. Absolutely, Ambassador, and that's essentially what India is looking at doing, diversifying to other markets, whether it's related to diversifying in terms of geographies or diversifying in terms of goods. And of course, the American hypocrisy, well, that's for everybody, all the world to see. In fact, that's been exposed by China, Russia, and of course, India multiple times as well. But on that note, gentlemen, thank you very much for taking the time out and sharing your perspectives on this developing story. Appreciate you taking the time out and speaking to us here on ET Now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And ladies and gentlemen, time for us to slip into a very short break.